Have you ever had a game that was incredibly hard for you to get into? A game you really wanted to play, but for some reason there was something constantly pushing you away from it. Something that prevented you from truly enjoying it. That kind of game for me used to be Morrowind. See, I really struggled to get into Morrowind despite trying my, at the time, hardest to get it. I used to pour hours into this game thinking I just need to keep pushing a little more until it finally becomes enjoyable, but it didn't, at least not at first. Morrowind is one of the very few games I ever shelved or even considered to have abandoned after having put so many hours into it. It was only really last year, or in 2025 if you're watching this in the future, that I managed to properly appreciate Morrowind for the kind of game that it is. It took me some time, but I actually managed to beat it, and guess what? It was pretty good. I actually quite loved it. I might even argue it opened my eyes in some ways when it comes to game design, but we're gonna get into that later. It wasn't without some difficulties, but I managed to develop a lot of appreciation for Morrowind while I was playing it. So in this video, I want to identify what made Morrowind so hard for me to get into and why I initially shelved it. I also want to talk about why I came back to it this last year and what ultimately made me actually like the game. And to set it all off, I want to give some advice for people who might want to get into Morrowind too. But before we do all that, let's just go one step further back because I want to talk about why I even wanted to play Morrowind in the first place. I think the first time I wanted to play Morrowind must have been around mid to late 2022. I used to be crazy for open world games during most of my teenage years. I also had a growing interest in tabletop RPGs like D&D at the time. Although, I have to admit, I never actually got to play the real thing myself. At the time, I was playing games like GTA 5 and the 3D Fallout titles a lot. I love these games, but I was starting to yearn for something different. See, what I really wanted to play was a game that would offer the kind of world that RPGs are generally known for. Because if you think of an RPG, you will most likely first imagine something with a medieval fantasy kind of setting. And the same applied to me. I was looking for something with magic and swords and dungeons, you know, something I was really familiar with from books and films, but had never actually played before. Now, I already mentioned I had played a lot of Fallout, and when I say a lot, I do actually mean a lot. I have put literal hundreds, if not thousands of hours into these games combined over the last few years. But Fallout is no medieval fantasy series. In fact, it couldn't be further removed from that. However, Fallout is developed by Bethesda, and I think you know where I'm going with this. I'm just gonna cut to the chase. What I'm trying to get to is that I wanted to play an Elder Scrolls game. And this was a series I was always vaguely aware of. I mean, it is one of the most popular game series of all time after all. I bet you could ask any person on the street and they'd recognize the name Skyrim. So it obviously just made sense to start my journey into the world of fantasy RPGs right here. Now, I will be the first to admit that Morrowind is quite an odd choice for someone to pick as their first Elder Scrolls game. I mean, there are at least 4 other games in the series that I could have picked instead, 2 of which are even considered to be some of the best in the entire genre. Skyrim is even regarded as one of the most successful and influential games of all time. I mean, it seems like an obvious choice to just play Skyrim, right? So, why didn't I? Why Morrowind? While writing this video, I revised this part many times, and initially I used to have a very long-winded explanation here, but I ended up scrapping it because it was kind of pointless. So I am just going to cut to the chase. I prefer to play games in the order they were released in. I mean, it seems pretty obvious. You wouldn't watch a show or a series of movies out of order either, right? Usually these things tend to build on top of each other in one way or another, so they often require, or at the very least in some way benefit from context which you would only have if you have seen the previous installments. I think the same idea applies to games. Like, yeah, sure, you can play the Elder Scrolls games in any order. They do have self-contained plots after all, but they're still part of a bigger world. So some details of the lore might make more sense if you know part of the lore from the previous games. Not to mention that I think it's also very interesting to see how games in the series evolve both graphically and also mechanically. So now you might understand why I picked Morrowind over Skyrim or even Oblivion. Address me. Okay, fine, I'm gonna address it. The keen-minded of you have probably long deduced that Morrowind is in fact not the first installment in the Elder Scrolls series. So let me quickly explain why I didn't play Daggerfall, or even more appropriately, the Elder Scrolls Arena instead. I'm going to be brutally honest with you, I don't have a good explanation here, other than I simply didn't know these games were on Steam back then. See, I bought Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim as part of a bundle way back in the day. this was some time before I made the decision to actually play any of them, so I always just had those free lying around my Steam library. So, once I actually wanted to get into the Elder Scrolls series, I, for some messed up reason, must have never checked if the first 2 games were even available on Steam, which, by the way, they are, and also they would have been all the way back then, and instead I just went with the oldest entry I found in my library, which was Morrowind. I know this is a disappointing answer, but it is the truth. I used to think these games just weren't accessible back then, without bothering to look into it too much. Essentially what I'm trying to say is, I'm a hypocrite, okay? Is that what you want to hear? I'm a hypocrite. At the end of the day though, it is what it is. What really matters now is that I did end up playing Morrowind, and you know, how that went? Well, not that well, okay? So let's talk about why I couldn't get into Morrowind initially, and still had a hard time today. There are so many reasons someone might have trouble liking a game as old as Morrowind. For some, it might be the outdated graphics or the clunky controls. For others, it's the instability of these games, as older games didn't yet receive bug fixes and are thus prone to be broken, whether that's bugged quests or even crashes. I mean, it doesn't help we're talking about a Bethesda game here after all. These are all valid reasons to not like a game, but my real issue wasn't actually with any of these. Sure, they might have played a small part in my eventual disillusionment of Morrowind, but in the end, my problem mostly came down to a core misunderstanding of how the game itself worked. And to explain this misunderstanding to you, I will have to take a minute or two to explain the skill and combat system in Morrowind. Morrowind is an RPG, and so naturally it has a skill system. Skills in Morrowind affect everything, and when I say everything, I do genuinely mean everything. They affect your chances to pick locks, pass speech checks, and let you get better prices in bartering. Skills can also determine the effectiveness of your armor, and if you can cast certain spells, and much more. Even your walk speed and jump height are tied to their own respective skills. But what I want to focus on right now are the weapon skills. Every weapon type in Morrowind has a dedicated skill that you can level. For example, there's the short blade skill for weapons like daggers and some other smaller swords. Blunt weapon is for staves, clubs, maces and hammers, and marksman is for all things ranged like bows, throwing darts and so on. I think you get the point. Now, in most other games that I have played at least, a higher level of these skills usually allows for a high amount of damage being dealt or a higher chance of landing a critical hit. In Morrowind, however, this skill determines your chance of even landing a hit in the first place. You heard me right, Morrowind is a first-person action RPG in which you will entirely miss your attack if the RNG isn't on your side. Now, missing attacks isn't unusual for RPGs. This is a commonplace mechanic in most turn-based games, but once again, we are talking about a real-time first-person action RPG here. I can see my sword physically make contact with my enemy, so as far as I'm concerned, this should land me a hit unless there is some visual indication that the enemy blocked my attack, which in Morrowind there isn't. Now, I don't know about you, but I have never heard of a single first-person game which works like this before, let alone have I ever played one. So obviously, you can imagine that this hugely threw me off the first time I played Morrowind. What made this even more frustrating in my case was that every skill in the game can go up to 100. So, in the case of weapon skills, the level roughly corresponds to the percentage of attacks your character will successfully carry out. So if, let's say, your weapon skill is at like level 50, you would land an attack about 50% or half of the time. Now, by default, every skill is at like level 5 or maybe 10, and it is only for the race and class of the character that you create that you can have some of these skills be higher at the start of the game. So, with the right character, you can get some of these skills up to maybe around 35 or 40 at the beginning of your playthrough. So, let's say, hypothetically of course, you create a character with a race and class that both do not improve your marksman skill like at all. And let's assume, again, purely hypothetically, you try using bows a lot, but end up not hitting anything at all because your marksman skill is like level 5, and so you automatically miss like 95% of your attacks, while your enemy is absolutely whooping your ass, and your armor doesn't do shit, and every spell you try to cast fails, and you get mad because you're an idiot, but instead of just like changing the weapon you use, or using different armor or spells or no magic at all, you just keep trying to use your bow or whatever, and eventually you just get so annoyed that you just quit the game entirely. So anyways, you will never guess how my first playthrough went. Okay, but in all seriousness, I was trying to play with a playstyle that my character just wasn't really made for. I would use armor that didn't correspond to the skill set of my character, in this case heavy armor instead of light armor. I'd often try to use ranged weapons or even casting spells, despite not having selected marksman or even a single magic skill as one of my major or minor skills, while having them all be on level 5, which resulted in me failing to cast any spell at all with pretty much 100% certainty. I think you can understand how this can get quite frustrating after a few hours of playtime, especially when you feel like you're not making any significant progress. I'd keep getting killed by enemies so often and so quickly that I had to save scum my way through almost every single enemy encounter in the game. At some point, I think I just had enough of the game and I just didn't bother booting it up anymore. I really didn't put too much thought into Morrowind's skill system and character creator when I first played the game. I'd assumed that I could just, like so many times before in other games, make a character that looked cool and I'd somehow figure out the rest automatically and be okay, but it turns out that Morrowind isn't quite that forgiving. Once you've picked a set of skills, you're pretty much locked into using only those skills for at least the first few hours of your playthrough. There are no taking backs really, because if you don't play to the strengths of your character, then your RNG is just going to be so bad that you will fail to do pretty much anything at all. I honestly haven't played many RPGs like this before, especially more traditional old school ones. I also never really played a proper session of D&D either, which probably contributed to the issue. So I am still trying to get a feel for how these games work. A feel which I think I'm slowly starting to develop after having played Morrowind, but one that I definitely didn't have back when I first tried playing it. In retrospect, I think my biggest problem was also just my own stubbornness and stupidity, because I could have totally just looked up guides or advice for how to play the game online, or even read the manual which actually comes with the game on Steam, but I don't think I ever considered just changing the way I play or asking for advice, which was completely on me. This issue to some extent even followed me into this year when I attempted to give Morrowind a second try, just to end up making most of the same mistakes again. Just a few hours into my second playthrough, I was already pretty close to giving up again, and that is when I decided to leave a community post on the Steam forum of all places to vent out some of my frustrations while asking for advice. And honestly, I'm so fucking glad I did that, because the answers that people gave me, while understandably maybe a little passive-aggressive, were actually incredibly helpful in motivating me to give this game one last try and showing me what I have been doing wrong all this time. So now, let's talk about what ultimately made me like Morrowind. That Steam forum post is honestly a little embarrassing in retrospect, which is why I'm not gonna go into it too much and spare you the details, for both of our sakes honestly, but I think it was necessary for me to vent out my frustrations like that. I had received plenty of replies in the days following my post. Many people pointed out my mistakes in regards to the combat and skill system, which we already talked about at length. Some even recommended I play a modded version of the game, but I mostly ignored those comments as I wanted to get as close to vanilla experience as possible for my first playthrough. I also can't forget that one comment someone left with a bunch of YouTube links, one of which he captioned with "combat when you're ready." I'm still not quite sure what he meant by that, but the video he linked was a bunch of fast-paced Morrowind gameplay paired with Doom music, which I thought was pretty cool because up until then, I didn't even know any kind of fast-paced combat was even possible in this game. I never really ended up playing like this, but I just wanted to mention it because I think it was kinda neat. So, with the advice and knowledge gained from all these replies, I would set out on my third and final attempt at playing Morrowind. I'd watch for the intro cutscene as usual, create my character, this time with a little more thought than before, then I'd do the usual tutorial quests, before finally getting ready to start the main quest. And it was almost as if someone had flipped a switch, immediately so much more fun than the first two times around. I actually felt myself making progress and exploring parts of the map that I never even got to on my first run. Over the course of my playthrough, I really got to appreciate the world and the design of this game, which finally brings us to the real reason I even wanted to make this video. I finally get to yap about all the cool mechanics and design decisions this game has, many of which were completely new to me. Honestly, there are so many aspects of this game I have grown to love that it's hard to pick one to begin with, but I think it makes the most sense if I first talk about three major aspects which had already stood out to me all the way back in 2022. These were actually a huge part of the reason why I even came back to Morrowind in the first place. So, let's start with what is probably my favorite one, and then just go from there. So, at number 1 we have the journal. Holy shit, do I love the journal in Morrowind. Just like every other open world game ever, Morrowind also has a quest system. In most games, quests are tracked in a dedicated menu which has a list of all your quests, a summary of the quests you have currently selected, and a marker telling you what you're supposed to do next. In Morrowind, however, this system works a little different. There isn't really a singular quest screen per se. Instead, you have an actual literal journal which will automatically record the relevant information during your playthrough. So, whenever you talk to an NPC and they give you a quest or they tell you any other important information, it will get marked down in your journal as a new entry even with the current in-game date. This is cool for a bunch of reasons, because using the journal in Morrowind feels like your character is actually taking notes while you're playing the game, and you can just go and look at those notes. This essentially gives you a complete chronologically ordered log of your entire playthrough to look up whenever you want. Oh, and if you're wondering, active quests can still be viewed in the list, but clicking on them will only give you a list of all the related notes and no summaries or direct instructions. Which brings me to something else which also makes the journal system of Morrowind interesting. It has no quest markers or anything of the like. Every time the game wants you to go somewhere or find a specific character, it will just tell you a place, name, and or the general direction of where you have to go in plain text. And then it's on you to use this information to find out what or who you're looking for. I personally really like this approach because it encourages or sometimes even forces you to engage with the game world more, because you have to think more about what your next move is. In most newer open world titles that I have played, like let's take Horizon Zero Dawn for example, you will just get a marker on your map or on your HUD and you just start walking towards it in a straight line. Now this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but for me it just makes my brain turn off after a while, and I'll play the game in complete autopilot because all I have to do is just press the forward key and follow the shining dot in the distance. Another cool thing about the journal is that it can sometimes also serve as a sort of dictionary or encyclopedia of knowledge about the game world. So sometimes you might encounter a word or a name that doesn't tell you much, but with a bit of luck you've already read about it early in your playthrough, so then you can look it up in the topic section of your journal. Alternatively, you can also just click on a word in a more recent entry if it's highlighted to see every other entry that also mentions that word. Obviously, the journal system isn't perfect. Sometimes the directions it gives you are not very helpful. In some rare cases, I did wish I had an actual quest marker, because to give you an example of something that actually happened to me, I once spent like an hour exploring a dungeon while looking for an item just to find out it was on a random ghost I'd already killed like 30 minutes earlier. Also, sometimes the journal just doesn't log info that I as a player would consider important enough to be logged, but that's quite subjective, I guess. These are all definitely things I'd want to be better, but I still think I prefer Morrowind's journal system over the nowadays more commonplace quest markers. I even went as far as to turn quest markers off entirely when I played Cyberpunk 2077 recently, as a result of me playing Morrowind, but that is a discussion for another day perhaps. Second is the user interface. This is a pretty short one as I don't have too much to say about it, but Morrowind has a very unique user interface in a way I don't think I've seen in many video games before. In Morrowind, you can completely customize your inventory screen, and honestly, I love that. Essentially, all your menus like the inventory, spells, skills, and the map are all separate little windows which you can freely move around and resize to get whatever layout you prefer. It's kinda like an operating system like Windows. I just think this is a really neat system as it allows you to decide how much screen space you want to dedicate to different menus. I think the reason few other games have interfaces like this is probably because menus like this must be a real pain to make work for controllers, which is understandable. I still wouldn't complain about more games doing it though. Here's something cool I didn't know until after I finished my playthrough, but you can actually pin any window to your HUD permanently if you want to. I also want to squeeze in here real quick that I love the drag and drop functionality of the menus. Dragging items onto your character to equip them or just dropping them onto the floor feels quite smooth and satisfying. I really love the sound effects for it too, like just listen to how it sounds when you equip a piece of armor. Ooh, it's so good. Third and last but not least, we have the dialogue system. I already briefly mentioned the topic system from the journal earlier, which is pretty much the same thing that the entire dialogue in Morrowind is built around. Whenever you engage in dialogue with an NPC, you get a list of topics to choose from. The topics available to you can vary depending on the kind of NPC you're talking to and whether or not they are actually relevant to that NPC. Selecting one of these topics is kinda like if you asked about it, and in response, the NPC you're talking to will give you a short answer. This answer can also vary sometimes depending on the faction, class, or location of the NPC. This means that selecting the same topic with different NPCs can sometimes get you unique responses. Oftentimes, talking to an NPC will make them mention new topics and subsequently unlock those to be selectable in dialogue. This makes the dialogue feel somewhat dynamic, with NPCs mentioning one or two new topics and then giving you the choice to pick one of those to inquire about further. You can then also bring those topics up with other NPCs if it's relevant to them. Maybe I can explain it a little more using one of my favorite quests in the game. Most quests in Morrowind you will stumble across by just using the latest rumor option and dialogue, which will make some NPCs bring up potential quests to the area. One of these is in the city of Vivek, where many NPCs will tell you about a series of mysterious killings. This will lead you to find a character in the Hall of Justice who will officially ask you to look into the matter, thus starting the quest. Now, once you have that information, you will have the option to ask around Vivek, which will often just give you generic answers, but eventually you'll find out more details about this woman and where to find her. It's a bit of a daunting quest considering the size of Vivek, but the effort you have to put in while solving this quest is also what I like about it. But that is about it for the 3 big aspects of Morrowind that already stood out to me all those years ago. So, what about all the other stuff I only really got to experience once I started delving deeper into what this game has to offer? Actually, let's go back to the combat and skill system again, just for a quick excursion before we talk about some bigger things. I complained about it earlier, but the combat in Morrowind actually does get quite enjoyable after a while. Yes, it does feel very sluggish and slow at first, but it does actually get a lot better as you progress through the game. When you start out, as we already discussed, your attacks will miss most of the time, but the more you use weapons of your preferred skill, in my case that was long blades, the more you start to train that skill, allowing you to land more hits. Also, just walking around gets faster with time too, as your athletics skill passively levels with your character. Essentially, what's going on here is that all skills in Morrowind level passively by simply performing actions related to that skill. So, when you use a specific weapon type or magic type a lot, then eventually your character will become incredibly proficient in that skill. You could almost say there's a sort of learning curve here, where the better you get at a skill, the easier it is to level and master and perform it, which I like. I think this is the game's way of telling you that you are going to have a way easier time if you just focus on the skills your created character is already experienced in. And even if you for some reason still have a change of heart when it comes to certain skills you didn't pick early into the game, then there is still the option to get training from some NPCs to bring those skills up to a tolerable level during the late game. It will cost you a lot of gold though. And I just want to throw out there that there are so many different skills and resulting playstyles for this game that I haven't even been able to scratch the surface of what is possible. For example, there's like 8 different types of magic in this game you can specialize in, not to mention a bunch of different armor and weapon types. There are also plenty of skills to make a thief build, but I have heard that the stealth system in this game is quite broken and unfair, so doing Thieves Guild quests might be a little difficult to do unless your sneak skill is crazy high. I have some bigger things to talk about still lined up, but Morrowind is a gigantic game, so naturally there are a few smaller aspects of it that are also notable. Not necessarily in the way that I can say a lot about them, but I still want to briefly mention them. The soundtrack, for example, is quite nice. Especially that title theme is going to be ingrained in your brain forever. I don't think it's the craziest soundtrack I've ever heard, but it captures the overall vibe of Morrowind really well. I am also a fan of how detailed some of the cities in this game are. You can enter pretty much any building you come across. They are all fully decorated on the inside, and most of them have inhabitants with full names. Actually, the NPCs, even the unimportant ones having names, is nice after having played games like Fallout 4, where half the characters are just called Settler. I think it gives them a little more personality, even when they are still just generic NPCs. It also makes it a little less obvious which NPCs are actually quest related, which adds a little more to the challenge of playing. To go back to Fallout 4, if a character in that game was named, then they were almost guaranteed to be quest related. It made some of the quests in that game a little too easy to solve, because it would heavily narrow down the NPCs you had to talk to make progress. One more thing, when you get caught for doing a crime in Morrowind, then usually you will have the option to either pay a fine, go to jail, or resist the guards and fight them. Pretty much every other Bethesda game I've played so far immediately makes all the NPCs in an area forever attack you on sight if you happen to hit them even once. So I think Morrowind's system in this regard is a lot better and also more forgiving. I also think it helps the immersion a little more. And while we're already talking about immersion, I think this is a good moment to transition into my final topic, that being the lore and world building. I think honestly my favorite aspect of Morrowind overall is its overall story and world. Morrowind, and I'm going to assume by extension the Elder Scrolls as a whole, has some of the most expansive lore and world building I've personally ever seen. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I don't want to spoil anyone who hasn't played the game already, but trust me when I say that there's a lot of cool stuff here. Morrowind's story mostly follows the Chosen One trope, which isn't the most creative, but there is a bit of a twist to it. As the main character, you enter the world of Morrowind as a released prisoner from the outside world, who soon finds out that they actually play a major part in an ancient prophecy. And so the twist in Morrowind is that the prophecy is actually quite vague and strict at the same time, and so you first have to prove that you're worthy of the prophecy and truly the person it talks about. Reading this out loud, it sounds a little stupid, but it makes sense if you played the game. Morrowind's local tribes are incredibly xenophobic, and so you have to spend most of the game trying to gain their trust. This is all I'm going to say for now, as the lore and the plot of this game are way too convoluted to go into detail, and I already fear this video is going to be way longer than I initially planned. Also, once again, I'm just trying to keep this spoiler free. I am not quite done talking about the world building though, as one of my favorite details of the world building and just general game design in Morrowind are the fast travel methods. You see, fast travel in Morrowind is only possible for either Silt Striders, boats, or Mage Guild teleporters. Most major towns in Morrowind will have at least one or sometimes even two of these free options available. So, when you use a Silk Strider, you can only travel to other towns that also have Silk Strider stations. When you use a boat, you can only travel to seaside towns with ports. When you use a Mage Guild teleporter, you can only travel to towns that also have a Mage Guild. So you can't just travel from any town to any other town. You usually have to see what Mage Guild is closest to where you want to go, for example. On top of that, you can also only travel to other towns close by. So you can't just instantly go from one end of the map to another, as that will be way too far to travel at once. But let's say you do actually want to travel a distance that far. In this case, you will have to plan a route that utilizes and combines multiple different travel methods with different stops in between. Let's actually get an example up on the screen. Let's say you start in Nisus on the west side of the map and you want to travel all the way to Sat of Mora on the eastern end. To do so, you would first have to take the Silk Strider in Nisus to get to Seda Nean. In Seda Nean, you would then take another Silk Strider to get to Vivek. In Vivek, you can now go to the boat dock right next to the Silk Strider station and take a boat to Tel Brenora. And in Tel Brenora, you can now finally take one last boat to Sad River Mora. You can kind of think of it like using public transport, because that is pretty much exactly what it is. And just like with real public transport, this obviously isn't the only path you can take either, as there are obviously other ways to get to Sad River Mora if you decided to take the Mage's Guild into account, for example. I think this fast travel system is neat in a world building sense, because these would be pretty much the same fast travel methods regular citizens of Morrowind would realistically have to take to get to places. It also makes fast travel less overpowered. Morrowind hits a nice sweet spot when it comes to fast travel, because you don't have to physically walk across the entire map, but you also can't just instantly teleport wherever you please with no cost, because fast travel also costs a little bit of gold. So, not only is Morrowind's fast travel engaging, but it also can be explained and made sense of within the context of the game world, and thus adds to the world building of the game. And if there's one thing I'm a huge sucker for, then it is game mechanics that make actual in-universe sense. I do really love the world they built in this game, as Morrowind feels like it has genuine history. Over the course of the game, you learn a lot about ancient conflicts, sometimes even from different perspectives. You hear about the civilizations that were part of those conflicts, many of which are now gone, but their architecture and ruins still remain for you to explore. There's guilds, cults, tribes, religions, gods, rulers, slavery, racism, drugs, and diseases, which even you as the player can catch, and a bunch of other wonderful stuff that all comes together to create what I think is a believable world. I wish I could go into more detail, but if you have played the game, then you should already know what I'm talking about, and if you haven't, then I encourage you to give it a try. I don't want to leave you empty-handed in the case of the latter anyways, so for a final big chapter in this video, here is my advice for new Morrowind players and people trying to get into the game. Really, my biggest hope for this video is that I might actually put someone onto a game they have never played before, or maybe motivate someone else who, like me, had previously dropped the game to pick it back up again. As much as I may have talked about how much I like Morrowind, I have to still admit that it isn't the most forgiving game to get into, partly due to its design and also because of the many bugs and crashes that you might run into. Which is why my first advice for when you play the game is that you install OpenMW. You don't have to, but I really recommend it if you're having trouble with frequent crashes or other bugs and annoyances that might significantly worsen your experience. Without going into any technical details, you can imagine OpenMW as a community-developed rewrite of Morrowind, which is pretty much identical to the base game, but offers a bunch of bug fixes and adapts the game for modern systems and screen resolutions. There are options to tweak certain arguably bugged game mechanics, but you can turn them off if you don't want them. I personally installed it mostly because my game would keep crashing every time I tapped out, which became annoying very quickly, but I still kept most of the tweaks and other major changes disabled so that I could still get the overall vanilla experience. Once again, the gameplay and graphics tweaks are all optional and you can just leave them off. I know I've said that I didn't want to play with mods, but I have played a significant amount of Morrowind with and without OpenMW, and trust me, they are pretty much identical, but one of them is a lot more stable. At the very least, you should read through the OpenMW FAQ page before you start a new playthrough to make a decision. My second advice is that you should simply learn from my mistakes. Unless you just skip to this part of the video, you should already know by now that character creation will have a big impact on at least the earlier hours of your playthrough. So, take your time to consider what kind of build you want your character to be and what to specialize in. Also, while I was recording footage for this video, this happened to me, so never ever engage in combat with low fatigue if your opponent uses unarmed combat, as you will likely just get stuck in a constant stun loop. Don't be afraid to look things up if you get stuck early on, and make sure to max out your main weapon skill as much and as fast as possible. My third advice is that you have patience. Morrowind is very much a slow burn game, and it will take some time to understand its systems. Your first few hours can and will feel a little like a drag, as it takes some time until your character is leveled to a degree that makes traversal of the map and combat quick and snappy. Your first few combat encounters are still going to be very close calls, but it does get better very quickly. Some human enemy encounters can be tough early on, so go out and level by fighting things like rats and other generic enemies first if you feel like you're too weak for an encounter, or do other quests and then come back later. You also require patience and a decent attention span if you want to really get into the story and lore, as most of it is explained through a lot of text and in-game books. You don't have to read everything, but the main quest will sometimes require some time to slow down and read from you. My fourth and final piece of advice is that you should not be afraid to use the wiki or console when you're stuck. Because for as much as I have gushed about Morrowind for most of this video, it is still not only an old game, but an old Bethesda game, which means that even after installing something like OpenMW, there are still oftentimes situations where you might run into a bug or get stuck in some way, maybe even without noticing. If something feels off or a quest doesn't progress despite you thinking that it should, then don't hesitate to look it up on the UESP wiki, as it is very likely that something bugged out. To give you an example from my own playthrough, I was doing a quest late into the game where I had to kill a specific enemy and then loot his corpse to receive a unique item from him, but when I got to the dungeon he was supposed to be hiding out in, I had apparently already killed him and his corpse seemed to have unloaded, which meant I couldn't pick up the quest item I was supposed to get. The only way for me to progress the quest at that moment was to manually add the item to my inventory through console commands. Situations like that happened to me a good half a dozen times during my playthrough, which is why it's likely that you will encounter similar softlogs too. Another example I got is when I was supposed to deliver a book to this guy in the Vivek Mages Guild, but when I finally got around to doing so, it turned out that I had long lost or sold the book somewhere else, because Morrowind doesn't have any system that would prevent you from losing quest items. There are also some quests which technically have multiple ways to be completed, but only one of them is considered the official solution by the game, so if you solve them in alternate ways, they won't get marked as completed in your journal. I would also use commands here sometimes to mark these off as finished, so that they wouldn't clutter up my quest list, but that's up to you. I think what I learned the most when playing Morrowind is that it's important to stay open-minded when it comes to playing older games like this. People love these games for a reason, even if the reason might not be immediately obvious to you. Morrowind isn't a bad game like I thought it was at first, it was just designed with different ideas and goals in mind than what you might find in RPGs today. And oftentimes, these ideas made games back in the day more complex and harder to get into. Like, I think there's a reason why old games like this often came with a guide or a manual. The way they work might not always be obvious, or is too much to be explained with just a simple tutorial. Which, yes, can be a design flaw depending on how you look at it, but I think it is oftentimes also intentional. I've been watching a lot of Tim Cain videos recently. For those who don't know, Tim Cain is the creator of the original Fallout games, and not only did his videos really make me want to play all his old RPGs, in fact I actually played for the original Fallout just recently because of those videos, and it was a blast, but his videos also made me understand that oftentimes RPGs are giving you little instructions on purpose. These games are not always telling you what to do because they have faith that you will be able to figure it out by yourself. They don't want to force a way of playing them onto you, and instead let you experiment with their mechanics so you have the freedom to create your own playstyle. I think many old RPGs also assume that you have already played another RPG before. These games used to be always quite niche after all, with most of their intended audience being diehard nerds. Something I intentionally left out earlier when I was talking about why I chose Morrowind over Skyrim or even Oblivion was that I think I also was trying to challenge myself. I wanted to prove to myself that I am capable of playing and enjoying games like this, even if they might be daunting to get into at first. I think it's important to step out of your comfort zone like that every once in a while and play something that you usually wouldn't want to play. You might end up liking it. And even if the game you played wasn't quite to your taste, it might still help you broaden your horizon and help you find another game that will be. I'm sure that most of the things I praised about Morrowind in this video aren't exclusive to it, and there might even be other games that do all of that stuff, but even better. There are actually plenty of criticisms I have for Morrowind that I chose not to go into in this video. There's many quests in this game that you could have discussions about being unfinished, arguably broken mechanics. I didn't even as much as mention the expansions in this video and just how bullshit the balancing of all the enemies in the Blood Moon expansion is. But I think me trying out Morrowind is going to prove to have been an important step to finding those other games which I would like even more someday in the future. I'd say that I am way more willing to check out Daggerfall now than I was before all of this. I also noticed that about a year ago, I would have looked at a game like Baldur's Gate 3 and thought it looks boring because of its camera perspective, but after having played the original Fallout recently, I have developed a completely new relationship with isometric games. Now I am not just open to, but actually stoked to play not only Baldur's Gate someday, but also a lot of other old school RPGs. But for the time being, I'm going to play some other stuff. I already have plans to play Oblivion this year and maybe Skyrim the year after, so who knows, maybe I'll talk about those games too someday. I mean, I don't have the best track record of keeping these promises, but who knows. I started writing this video right after I finished Morrowind back in like August of last year, and it has since only kept on growing. It's been like half a dozen revisions, but I think I finally managed to write a version of the script I'm happy with. So here's to hope it has turned out well and people are going to like it. If you made it to this point, I assume you did, so thank you and thanks for watching.